I thought it was just an ordinary Tuesday, quiet, gray, unremarkable in every possible way. I had been folding laundry on the couch, a cup of tea going cold on the coffee table beside me, the kind of slow afternoon that feels almost guilty in its peacefulness. The apartment smelled like fabric softener and the faint traces of the soup I'd made for lunch, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the street below. I had no reason to believe that anything about that afternoon would be different from 100 other afternoons just like it. I had no reason to believe that by the time the sun went down, everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my home, and the woman who called herself my family would be lying in pieces on that same floor where I'd been standing, folding Dimitri's shirts like a woman who still had a life worth folding laundry for. Then my phone buzzed on the cushion beside me, and the world shifted. I picked it up without thinking, the casual, automatic gesture of someone who expects a grocery reminder or a message from a friend. What I saw instead made the air leave my lungs in one silent, invisible rush. It was from Dimitri, my husband, the man I had built 7 years of my life around, the man whose shirts I had just been smoothing with my own hands. The message was short, it was ugly, and it was written in the voice of someone I did not recognize. "Mom just called me. She says you pushed her down the stairs. I don't know what's wrong with you. Get ready. I'm leaving work right now, and you are going to regret this." I read it once, then again, then a third time, the words blurring slightly at the edges, the way words do when your brain refuses to fully process what your eyes are clearly seeing. My hands were steady. That surprised me, even then, the strange stillness of my hands when everything inside me had gone very cold and very quiet. I set the phone down on the coffee table next to my cold tea, and I walked to the window. Not because I had a plan, not because I knew what I was going to do. I walked to the window simply because my body needed to move, needed to put some distance between me and those words, needed to find something real and solid to look at while my mind tried to catch up with what had just happened. And there she was, Valentina Sergeyevna, my mother-in-law. 61 years old, a woman who wore her silver hair in a tight, deliberate bun and her grievances like a second skin, was standing at the entrance to my building. She was not hunched over. She was not limping. She was not clutching her arm or pressing a hand to an injured hip, the way a woman who had just been pushed down a flight of stairs might reasonably be expected to do. She was standing perfectly upright, her handbag hooked over her forearm, her phone pressed to her ear, and she was talking and gesturing and talking some more, with the fluid, animated energy of a woman who was not in pain, but in performance. I watched her from 3 floors up, and I felt something cold and clear crystallize in my chest. Not quite anger yet, not quite grief, but something harder than both, something that felt, for the first time in years, like clarity. I knew exactly what had happened. I knew exactly what she had told him, and I knew, with a certainty that settled over me like cold water, that whatever came next was not going to be a conversation. It was going to be a reckoning. To understand what happened that Tuesday, you have to understand what the 6 months before it looked like. You have to understand the slow, patient, almost architectural way that Valentina had built the structure of my unhappiness. Brick by careful brick, so gradually that I had barely noticed the walls going up until the day I looked around and realized I was standing in a room with no doors. Dimitri and I had met 8 years earlier at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, the kind of crowded, noisy apartment gathering where everyone is talking too loudly and someone always spills wine on the tablecloth. He had been sitting at the far end of the table laughing at something, and I had thought, there is a man who laughs with his whole face. I had liked that. I had liked him. Within 6 months, we were inseparable, and within 2 years, we were married in a small ceremony in his hometown, surrounded by his enormous extended family and my quieter, more reserved one. My mother had squeezed my hand at the altar and whispered that I looked beautiful. Valentina had stood in the front row in a dress that was, if I'm being precise, only marginally less formal than mine, and had cried in the elaborate, visible way of a woman who wants everyone in the room to notice that she is crying. I had found it touching at the time. I had thought, she loves her son so much. How lucky he is. How lucky we are. I understand now that what I had witnessed was not love. It was a territorial display, and I had been too young and too hopeful to read the difference. For the first few years of our marriage, Valentina's behavior was merely exhausting rather than dangerous. She called Dmitri every day, sometimes twice, and the calls were always long and always seemed to end with him slightly diminished, slightly deflated, like a balloon that someone had let just a little air out of. She had opinions about everything: how I cooked, how I kept the apartment, whether my job in marketing was sufficiently serious for a woman of my education. She would deliver these opinions with a warm smile and the prefatory phrase, "I'm only saying this because I care about you both," which I came to understand was her version of a legal disclaimer, a way of saying something harmful while preemptively denying responsibility for the harm. I had learned, over time, to smile and nod and say, "Thank you, Valentina Sergeyevna, I'll keep that in mind," and then go into the kitchen and press my forehead against the cool tile of the wall and breathe. Dmitri knew his mother was difficult. He admitted this freely, even sometimes apologized for her in the vague, helpless way of someone apologizing for the weather. "She means well," he would say. "She just doesn't always know how to show it." And I would look at him, this man I loved, this man who laughed with his whole face, and I would think, maybe she means well. Maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I should try harder. I tried harder for 6 years. I brought her flowers on her birthday and remembered the names of her friends and sat through 4-hour Sunday lunches listening to stories about Dmitri's childhood that were always, somehow, subtly designed to remind me that I was the newcomer in this story, the supporting character in a narrative that had been running long before I arrived. I tried harder and harder and harder still, and the harder I tried, the more clearly I could see that it was never going to be enough. Because what Valentina wanted was not my effort. What she wanted was my absence. The shift, the real shift, the one that changed everything, happened 6 months before that Tuesday afternoon, when Dmitri and I inherited my grandmother's apartment. My grandmother, Nadezhda Ivanovna, had died in the spring after a long illness, peaceful and surrounded by people who loved her, in the apartment on Lesnaya Street where she had lived for 40 years. She had left the apartment to me, specifically to me, not to Dmitri, not to both of us jointly, but to me, her granddaughter, in a will that was clear and properly notarized and entirely unambiguous. I had wept when the lawyer read it out. I had thought of my grandmother's hands, the smell of her kitchen, the particular quality of light in her front room in the late afternoon. The apartment was not large, and it was not in a fashionable neighborhood, but it was mine, and it was hers, and the thought of living in it felt like a kind of continuation, like carrying something of her forward into my own life. We had been living in a rented flat across the city. Moving into my grandmother's apartment meant we would finally have a home of our own. No landlord, no rent, no precariousness. It was, practically speaking, a significant and life-changing thing. I had been so happy. I had stood in the empty rooms the day we got the keys, and I had turned in a slow circle, and I had thought, this is ours. This is mine. We are going to be all right. What I did not know, what I could not have known, because no one told me, was that the moment Valentina learned about the inheritance, something in her had gone very still and very calculating. I know this now because of what came later, but in those early weeks of planning the move, she had been almost warm, calling to offer help with the packing, asking about renovation plans with what seemed like genuine interest, bringing over a casserole one Sunday and sitting in my grandmother's kitchen and saying, with a smile that I should have looked at more carefully, "What a lovely space this is, so much potential." I had been grateful. I had thought, maybe things are changing. Maybe this is a new chapter. The new chapter began, as it turned out, with a demand. Moving day was a Saturday in October. Dmitri had arranged for 2 of his friends to help with the heavy furniture, and I had spent the previous 3 days packing with the kind of focused, slightly manic energy that comes from finally doing something you've been waiting to do for months. The morning was cold and bright, the sky that sharp October blue that makes the whole city look freshly washed. And I remember standing in the doorway of the new apartment with a box of kitchen things in my arms and feeling, for one perfect, suspended moment, completely and entirely happy. Valentina arrived at noon. We had not invited her, not because we were hiding anything, but because moving day is chaotic and exhausting, and I had privately hoped for one day, just one day, that belonged to Dmitri and me alone. But there she was, appearing in the doorway in her good coat, with a bag of what turned out to be cleaning supplies. Because you always need cleaning supplies when you move in somewhere new, Agnieszka. And a proprietary air that I noticed, but chose not to name. She moved through the apartment the way a person moves through a space they are already mentally rearranging. She opened cupboards without asking. She looked at walls and made small sounds, not quite approving, not quite disapproving, the sounds of a person reserving judgment. She picked up one of my grandmother's ceramic figurines from the windowsill where I had just placed it and turned it over in her hands with a thoughtful expression. And I had the irrational but overwhelming urge to take it from her. The afternoon passed in the way that moving afternoons do, all noise and effort and boxes in the wrong rooms, and by 5 o'clock the furniture was in and the friends had gone, and the 3 of us were sitting on the floor of the half-assembled living room eating pizza from a box. Dmitri was tired and satisfied in the way of a man who has done physical work and feels good about it. I was tired and happy in the way of a woman who has finally come home. And Valentina was sitting with her back very straight and her slice of pizza barely touched, and she was looking around the room with the expression I had learned to be afraid of, the expression of a woman who has decided that the time for waiting is over. She set down her pizza. She smoothed her skirt. She looked at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. It never did, not really, that smile. It stopped just below them, a warm curve of lips that somehow left the eyes untouched, watchful, assessing. And she said, in the pleasant, reasonable tone of someone making the most natural request in the world, "Anya, I was thinking, you should give me a key." I looked at her. I waited for the rest of the sentence, the context, the justification, the qualifier that would make this make sense. "A key to the apartment," she clarified, as though I might have misunderstood. "In case of emergencies, you know how these things are. A pipe can burst, the neighbors can have a problem. It's just sensible. I'll keep it in my bag. You'll never even know I have it. We're family, Agnieszka." The room was very quiet. Dmitri was looking at the pizza box, not at me, not at his mother, at the pizza box, with the studied concentration of a man who has decided that the pizza box is the most interesting thing in the room. I felt something move in my chest, a slow, careful shifting, like tectonic plates adjusting. I kept my voice entirely neutral. I said, "I appreciate the thought, Valentina Sergeyevna, but I don't think that's necessary right now. If there's ever an emergency, you can call us and we'll be here in 20 minutes. The smile stayed on her face. It did not waver or falter or shift. But something behind it changed, something subtle and chilly, like a window opening somewhere in a warm room. "Of course," she said, "of course. I understand completely." She left an hour later, kissing Dmitri on the cheek and patting my hand with cool, dry fingers. I watched her go down the stairs from the doorway, and I listened to the sound of her footsteps, precise, unhurried, deliberate. And I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was over. I told myself that I had handled it calmly and reasonably, and that there was nothing to worry about. I was wrong on all 3 counts. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in what I have since come to think of as Valentina's particular genius, her ability to apply pressure so gradually, so persistently, and so deniably that you begin to doubt your own perceptions. She did not ask for the key again. She didn't need to. Instead, she began a campaign of presents that was so relentless and so perfectly calibrated that by the end of the first month, I felt like a guest in my own apartment. She began coming by unannounced. Not every day. That would have been too obvious, too easy to push back against. Every few days. Always with a reason. A dish she had made and wanted to drop off. A question about the renovation she had thought of. Something she had seen in a shop that she thought might look nice in the hallway. She would ring the bell with a cheerful, proprietary knock. 2 short, 1 long, the same pattern every time, as though she had already assigned herself a signature. And when I opened the door, she would come in, not quite waiting to be invited, moving past me with the ease of someone who has decided that waiting to be invited is a formality that doesn't apply to her. I began to dread the sound of that knock. I am not proud of that. It seems like such a small thing, dreading a knock at the door. But there is something profoundly destabilizing about having your home, the place that is supposed to be the one space in the world that is entirely yours, feel like it belongs to someone else. I would be in the middle of working from home, or reading, or simply existing in the particular private way that human beings need to exist sometimes, and I would hear those 2 short knocks and 1 long one, and I would feel my whole body tighten. I talked to Dimitri about it. Carefully, reasonably, choosing my words with the care of a woman who has learned that the wrong words can be used against her. I told him that I loved his mother, and I understood her intentions were good, but that I needed us to establish some boundaries around unannounced visits, that I needed our home to feel like our home. Dimitri listened with the expression he always wore when the subject of his mother came up, a kind of pained, cornered look, like a man who can see 2 walls moving toward him and can't figure out which one to push against. "She means well," he said, for what must have been the 100th time in our marriage. "I know she means well," I said, with patience I did not entirely feel. "But meaning well and behaving well are not the same thing. Can you talk to her? Can you ask her to call before she comes?" He said he would. He did not. Or if he did, it made no difference, because Valentina's visits continued, slightly less frequent for perhaps 2 weeks, then gradually back to their previous rhythm, and then, if anything, more frequent, as though the mere act of asking her to stop had confirmed for her that she needed to escalate. It was during one of these visits, in the 3rd month after we moved in, that I began to notice other things, small things. A drawer in the kitchen that I was almost certain I had organized one way and found organized differently. A folder on the shelf in the hallway that seemed to have been moved. My grandmother's documents, the will, the property registration papers, the utility transfer documents, that I kept in a blue folder in the desk drawer in the 2nd bedroom, which I used as a home office. I could have sworn I had left it in a particular position. I found it slightly shifted, the papers inside not quite as I had left them. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was stressed and overworked and seeing patterns where there were none. I told myself this so many times and so firmly that I almost believed it. Almost. The Tuesday it all broke open began, as I said, like an unremarkable day. Dimitri had left for work at 8, kissing my forehead in the distracted way he had developed in recent months. Present in body, but somehow already elsewhere in mind. I had noticed this gradual withdrawal, this subtle dimming of his attention, and I had attributed it to work stress and the general exhaustion of the move. I had not yet allowed myself to consider other explanations. Valentina had called that morning at 9:30. I had let it ring. This was new. 2 months earlier, I would never have done this. I would have answered immediately and spent 20 minutes in the particular kind of polite, draining conversation that left me feeling emptied out. But something in me had begun, quietly and without fanfare, to change. I let it ring, and I went back to my work, and I thought nothing more of it. She arrived at 11, the 2 short knocks, 1 long. I was in the kitchen making coffee, and I heard it, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, and I closed my eyes for a moment, and then I went to the door and opened it. She was wearing her good coat again, the navy one, fitted, the one she wore when she wanted to feel authoritative. Her hair was in its usual tight bun. She was carrying her handbag over one arm and, I noticed, nothing else. No dish, no shopping bag, no pretext of a gift or a delivery. She had come empty-handed, which meant she had come with purpose. "Valentina Sergeyevna," I said. "I wasn't expecting you." "I was in the neighborhood," she said, which was what she always said, and which was, as far as I could tell, never quite true. I stepped back and let her in, because what else do you do when your husband's mother is standing in your doorway with that particular set to her jaw? You let her in. You make tea. You sit across from her at your own kitchen table, and you wait for whatever it is she has actually come to say. I made the tea. She sat at the table with her handbag on her knee and looked around the kitchen with that thoughtful, evaluating expression, and I set a cup in front of her and sat down across from her and waited. She was quiet for a moment, a calculated quiet, the quiet of a woman marshaling her words. Then she opened her handbag and took out a document and set it on the table between us. I looked at it without touching it. It was several pages, folded. I could see the top line of the first page, and what I could see made the coffee in my stomach turn to something cold and acidic. It was a property agreement. I could see my name, I could see Dmitri's name, and I could see hers. "What is this?" I said. My voice was very calm. I was surprised by how calm it was. "It's a co-ownership agreement," Valentina said, with the manner of someone explaining something simple to someone slow. "For the apartment. I've had it drawn up by a lawyer, a very good one. It formalizes the arrangement so that everything is clear and above board. I would have a 1/3 share, which is entirely reasonable given—" "Stop," I said. She stopped. "This is my apartment," I said. "It was left to me by my grandmother. It is registered in my name. There is no arrangement. There is nothing to formalize." "Agnieszka," she said, and her voice had shifted into its softest, most sorrowful register, the register that was supposed to make me feel that I was being cruel, that I was being unreasonable, that I was hurting a gentle old woman who only wanted to be close to her family. "I understand this is difficult for you to hear, but you have to understand that Dmitri is my son. This is his home too, and I am his mother. I have given everything for that boy, everything. I think the least that I am owed. You are not owed a share of my grandmother's apartment," I said. Her face changed. Not dramatically. Valentina was too controlled for dramatic changes. But the softness drained away, and what was left underneath was something harder and cooler, something that had always been there beneath the warmth and the casseroles and the 2 short knocks and 1 long one. "Dmitri thinks this is reasonable," she said. 4 words. 4 words that landed like 4 separate physical blows, each one finding a different bruise. I stared at her. I watched her face for the satisfaction that I knew must be there, but she kept it well hidden. She was good at that, hiding the things she wanted to hide. "Dmitri thinks this is reasonable," I repeated. The words felt strange in my mouth, foreign, like words in a language I had thought I spoke fluently and had just discovered I didn't understand at all. "We discussed it last week," she said. "He agrees that a family arrangement of this kind makes sense. He was going to talk to you himself, but—" She paused and allowed herself one small, almost imperceptible smile. "Well, you know how he is. He doesn't like conflict." I stood up. I am not entirely sure I was aware of doing it. My body simply decided, before my mind had finished processing, that I could not continue to sit across from this woman and remain in my current state. I stood up and I picked up the document from the table and I looked at it, really looked at it, the full 3 pages of it. And what I saw on the 3rd page made my vision go briefly white at the edges. There was a signature line for me. And above it, in a handwriting that was nearly but not quite mine, a handwriting that someone had practiced, that someone had worked at, that someone had spent time getting close enough to pass a first glance, was my name. Someone had signed it already. Someone had signed my name. The room did not spin. I want to be precise about this, because the cliché is that the room spins in moments like these, and mine did not. It went very still instead. Very sharp and very still and very quiet. The way the world goes sometimes just before a very loud sound. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear Valentina's breathing. I could hear, distantly, a car passing in the street below. And I remember thinking with a strange, dissociated clarity, that driver has no idea what is happening in this kitchen right now. "Whose signature is this?" I said. "Agnieszka, whose signature is this?" "We simply wanted to have everything prepared so that when you were ready—" "That is not my signature," I said. "I did not sign this document. I have never seen this document before today. And that," I set it back down on the table and pressed my finger against the page, "is a forgery." The silence that followed was of a particular and terrible quality. Valentina sat very still, her handbag on her knee, her expression something I could not quite read. Not fear, not exactly, but a recalibration. The expression of someone who has played a card and is now watching to see how the other player responds, reassessing their strategy in real time. Then she stood up. She picked up the document and put it back in her handbag. And she said, in a voice that was quiet and without emotion, "You're being hysterical." "I am being very calm," I said. "Please leave my apartment." What happened next happened quickly. She moved toward the door. I walked behind her, not touching her, not coming anywhere near her, keeping my distance the way you keep your distance from something you have finally recognized as dangerous. She reached the landing and she turned, and she said something I won't repeat, something ugly and precise, designed to wound. And then she turned again and went down the stairs. And then, 30 seconds later, my phone buzzed. "Mom just called me. She says you pushed her down the stairs. I don't know what's wrong with you. Get ready. I'm leaving work right now, and you are going to regret this." I stood at the window, and I watched her. Valentina, standing at the entrance below, perfectly intact, not a bruise or a limp or a tremor of injury anywhere on her composed and upright body, talking on her phone with the fluid animation of a woman narrating a story about me, a story she had constructed in the 30 seconds between stepping off my landing and reaching the pavement, a story as deliberate and as false as the signature on that document. The cold thing in my chest, the thing that had been crystallizing for weeks, maybe months, maybe the full 7 years of my marriage, solidified completely. It did not burn. That's the thing that surprised me most, standing there at the window with my phone in my hand and Dimitri's threat sitting on the screen in front of me. It did not burn at all. It was cold, clear, calm, with a depth and steadiness that I had never felt before in my life. It was the calm of a woman who has finally, fully, completely understood the situation she is in, and who has decided, with absolute certainty, that the situation is about to change. I had approximately 40 minutes before Dimitri arrived. I knew this because he worked 45 minutes away by car, and he would have left the moment he hung up with his mother, and he would drive fast because he was angry, and because he had told himself a story about what had happened here today, and that story had given him permission to be angry. He was coming to deliver consequences. He had said so. 40 minutes. I picked up my phone, and I did not call Dimitri back. I called my father. My father, Alexei Petrovich, is a retired civil engineer and the least dramatic person I have ever known. He speaks in complete sentences. He listens before he responds. He was the one who had come with me to collect my grandmother's keys after she died, who had stood in her quiet apartment with me while I wept, who had said nothing at all for 10 minutes and then said, "She would want you to live here happily. That's all she ever wanted for you." He was not the kind of man who raised his voice or made threats or sent messages promising that someone would regret something. He was the kind of man who, when I told him what had just happened in approximately 3 minutes of flat, controlled narrative, said, "I see. Don't touch that document. Do you have a photo of it? Good. I'm coming. Don't say anything to anyone until I get there. Then I called Marina. Marina has been my best friend since university, and she is a lawyer, not a property lawyer. She specializes in contract disputes. But she knows enough, and more importantly, she knows who to call. She picked up on the second ring, and I told her what I'd seen on that third page. And the quality of her silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know about how serious it was. That's document fraud, she said, and her voice was clipped and professional in the way it gets when she's already several steps ahead. Anya, I need you to photograph every page of that document if you have it. Did she take it with her? She had. All right. It doesn't matter. We have your testimony. I'm calling Constantine right now. Constantine was her colleague, a property lawyer. Don't let them pressure you into signing anything. Don't raise your voice. And if your husband says anything threatening when he arrives, I want you to record it. Do you understand me? I understood her. I had 25 minutes. I used them carefully. I photographed the text message from Dmitri, the full text, with the timestamp, with his name at the top. I wrote down in the Notes app on my phone a precise account of everything that had happened that morning, the time Valentina arrived, what she had said, what the document had contained, what the signature had looked like, the exact words she had used when she called me hysterical. I had been trained in years of working in marketing to document things, to keep records, to note dates and times, to create a paper trail. I had never thought I would need those skills in my own home. I used them now. I went to the desk in the second bedroom and I checked the blue folder. The will was there. The property registration was there. I took photographs of both, the notarized will in my grandmother's neat handwriting, the registration certificate with my name on it and no one else's, the date, the notary's stamp. I sent copies to Marina. I sent copies to my own email. I put the originals back in the folder and the folder in my bag where it would stay. My father arrived in 18 minutes. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, unhurried, steady, and when I opened the door, he looked at me for a moment, and then he came in and put his hand briefly on my shoulder, and that was enough. We didn't need more than that. Tell me everything, he said, sitting at the kitchen table where Valentina had sat 40 minutes before. I told him, all of it, not just today, but the months before it, the unannounced visits, the moved documents, the growing pressure, the key that had been demanded and refused and never mentioned again, but never truly abandoned. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "And Dmitri?" I looked at the table. She said they discussed it, that he agreed it was reasonable. My father was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "The forged signature, was it good?" "It was close," I said. "Close enough that someone might not look carefully, but I know my own handwriting." "Yes," he said, "you do." We heard them on the stairs, 2 sets of footsteps, and I recognized Dimitri's immediately, heavier than his mother's, faster. The door was unlocked. He came in first. He was flushed from driving and from whatever he had been telling himself on the way here, and when he saw my father sitting at the kitchen table, he stopped. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt, not yet, but a kind of recalibration, the same recalibration I had seen in Valentina's face 40 minutes before. He had been prepared for a certain kind of scene. My father's presence had made that scene unavailable to him. Valentina came in behind him. She looked at my father once and then at me, and her face was entirely composed. "Anya," Dmitri said, and his voice was strained, trying to find the register he had prepared for. "What happened? Mom says—" "Sit down, Mitya," I said. He blinked. I had not spoken to him like that before, not in that voice, that quiet, final voice that did not request but simply stated. He sat down. "You too, Valentina Sergeyevna," I said. She sat, slowly, with the careful dignity of a woman who is choosing to comply as an act of grace rather than because she has any obligation. "I'm going to say some things," I said. "I'd like you both to listen before anyone responds. Can you do that?" Dmitri looked at his mother. His mother looked at me. I waited. "Your mother came here today with a document," I said. "A co-ownership agreement for this apartment, the apartment that was left to me by my grandmother in a notarized will, and which is registered solely in my name. The document claimed that I had agreed to transfer a 1/3 ownership share to Valentina Sergeyevna." I paused. My name was signed on the document. I did not sign it. I had never seen the document before today. The silence was comprehensive. Dmitri was very still. "That is document fraud," I said. "Forging someone's signature on a property agreement is a criminal offense. I have spoken to a lawyer. The police can also be involved." "Agnieszka," Valentina said, and her voice had found its softest, most wounded register. "You're misunderstanding the situation. I also received a message from you, Dmitri," I said, and I unlocked my phone and held it up so he could see his own words on the screen, "in which you threatened me, in writing, with a timestamp." He read it. I watched his face as he read it, the flush deepening and then, slowly, changing quality. It is a particular and awful thing to watch a person read something they wrote and see it clearly for the first time. "And your mother," I said, "is standing here without a scratch on her, which you can verify with your own eyes, because I did not touch her. I showed her to the door. Those are the facts." Valentina made a sound, half protest, half something else. My father looked at her with the level, measuring gaze of a man who has been an engineer for 30 years and can calculate exactly how much weight a structure can hold before it fails. "I'd like to know," I said, turning to Dmitri, "what you and your mother discussed. She told me you agreed this arrangement was reasonable. She told me you discussed it last week." Dmitri opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his mother. And I watched it happen, the thing I had feared and half known and refused to fully know for months. I watched Dmitri look at his mother, and I watched his mother look back at him. And I watched the private language of a closed family system play out between them in a single, wordless exchange. And I knew, with a certainty that settled through me like cold water settling through sand, that she had not been lying. They had discussed it. He had known. Not perhaps about the forged signature. I chose to believe, because I needed to believe, that he had not known about that specific step. But the plan, the pressure, the slow, sustained campaign to prise open my life and insert his mother into it, that he had known about, that he had allowed, that he had, in his weak and silent and ultimately devastating way, enabled. "Mitya," I said very quietly, "did you know about this document?" He looked at the table. "Did you know she was coming here today?" Still the table. "Did you know she planned to pressure me into signing over part of my grandmother's apartment?" The silence was its own answer. It was the loudest thing in the room. "I see," I said. Marina arrived 40 minutes later with Konstantin, her colleague, who had a briefcase and the brisk, unhurried manner of a man who has seen variations of this situation before and knows precisely what to do about it. He sat at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, in my kitchen, in my apartment, and he set out several pieces of paper and he explained, in clear and measured language, exactly what the legal situation was. The forged signature, he said, constituted document fraud under the criminal code. Given that the document involved an attempt to fraudulently transfer partial ownership of a property, it was a serious matter, not a civil one. He looked at Valentina when he said this, and Valentina, for the first time in the months I had known her as something to be afraid of, looked uncertain. He also explained that the threatening text message Dmitri had sent constituted a documented threat, and that while it was a civil rather than criminal matter, it was relevant context if any further legal action were to follow. Valentina said, at some point during this, that she had only wanted to protect her son's interests, that she was his mother, that a mother had a right to look out for her child. Konstantin looked at her over the top of his glasses and said, with perfect calm, "Your son's wife is the registered sole owner of this property. Your son's interests, as her husband, are already protected under family law. A fraudulent co-ownership agreement would have given you rights to a property to which you have no legal claim. That is not protection. That is fraud. Valentina said nothing else. What happened in the following weeks I will compress, because the legal process is not a drama even when it happens alongside one. Constantine filed a formal complaint regarding the document fraud. Valentina's lawyer, the very good one she had used to draw up the agreement, turned out to be less willing to defend outright document fraud when confronted with the specifics, and there were discussions and negotiations and ultimately a formal acknowledgement that the signature was not mine and that the document had no legal standing. There were no criminal charges in the end. I chose not to push for them, because pushing for them would have required Dmitri to testify, and whatever else had happened between us, I could not bring myself to put him in that position. Marina thought I was too generous. She may have been right. Dmitri and I had the conversation I had been building toward for, in retrospect, most of our marriage. We had it in the kitchen, very late on the night after Marina and Constantine left, sitting across from each other at the same table where so much of this had played out, 2 cups of tea between us that neither of us was drinking. I let him talk first, let him explain, in his halting and painful way, how his mother had come to him months ago with the idea, how she had framed it as a matter of family security, how he had known it wasn't right, but hadn't been able to say no to her, how he had told himself it would never go this far. I listened to all of it. I listened to the whole architecture of his cowardice, laid out in the sad and honest language of a man who has finally been brought to the point where he can no longer pretend. "You knew," I said when he was done. "You knew for months, while I was making her tea, while I was letting her in and being polite and trying so hard, Mitya. You knew what she was planning, and you said nothing." I thought, "You thought what? That it would sort itself out? That I would somehow agree to hand over part of my grandmother's home, the home she left to me, and everything would be fine?" He looked at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and miserable, and I felt pity for him, genuine pity, the kind that doesn't cancel anger but exists alongside it, because he was, in his way, a casualty of this too. Not as I was, not in the same way, but his mother had made him a tool, and he had let her, and the cost of that was going to be borne by both of us. "I need you to choose," I said. "Not between me and her. I'm not asking that. I'm not interested in ultimatums. I'm asking you to choose between the man you actually want to be and the man she has always needed you to be. Because those are not the same man, Dmitri, and I cannot be married to both of them." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the city went about its nighttime business, the distant sound of traffic, someone's dog barking briefly in the courtyard below, the particular muffled hush of the world at 2 a.m. "I don't know if I know how," he said at last. Honest, at least. Finally honest. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." We separated formally in the spring. Not with drama. Dmitri and I were, at the end, better at being civil with each other than we had ever been at being honest, and the paperwork was completed without rancor. He moved back to his mother's neighborhood, which was perhaps inevitable. I stayed in my apartment. The legal matter with Valentina was resolved, as I said, without charges. She lost what she had sought to gain, which was everything she had planned for: the ownership share, the key, the access, the control. She lost these things not loudly or dramatically, but through the quiet machinery of the law, which she had tried to use as a weapon, and which had turned, calmly and without ceremony, against her. I was told by Marina some months later that Valentina had taken it badly, had told her friends and her relatives a version of events in which she was the wronged party, in which I was the villain of the story, in which her son had been stolen from her by a cold and calculating woman. I found, to my own surprise, that I did not particularly mind. Let her tell her story. I know mine. My father came for dinner in the autumn, 3 months after the separation, on a quiet Sunday when the trees outside were turning that particular shade of amber that makes everything look like a memory. He sat at the kitchen table, and I cooked the same soup my grandmother used to make, filling the apartment with the smell of it, bay leaves and slow-cooked meat, and something warm and ancient and deeply familiar. And we ate together without talking much, because we are a family that does not need to fill silence with words. After dinner, he sat with his tea and looked around the kitchen, at the ceramic figures on the windowsill, at the curtains I had chosen, at the small particular signs of a life being lived deliberately and on its own terms. And he said, "She would be pleased." "I know," I said. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the city was going about its evening, indifferent and unhurried, the way cities do. I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, in my grandmother's apartment, in my home, and I felt not happiness exactly, not yet, not the uncomplicated kind, but something more durable than happiness, something that does not depend on another person's choices in order to survive. Some things, once lost, do not come back. The 7 years, the marriage I had believed in, the particular kind of trust that, once broken in that specific way, not through passion or cruelty, but through silence, through looking at the table, through choosing the easier thing over and over and over again, cannot be fully rebuilt from the same materials. I had lost those things, and I did not pretend otherwise, and I did not perform a recovery I had not yet made. But the apartment was mine. My grandmother's hands had moved through these rooms for 40 years. My hands moved through them now. The keys were on the hook by the door. 2 sets, mine and my father's. And when I heard a knock, it was always expected, always invited, always welcome. Some doors, once you understand who you are, you simply do not open anymore. And that, I have come to understand, is not a loss. That is a different kind of key entirely, one that no one can take from you, one that opens nothing from the outside, but keeps everything on the inside safe. That is the one I will never give away.